As we are continuing our study in Leviticus, let me stop and ask, is there anything from last week that we feel like needs a little further attention or further discussion before we plow forward?
I wasn't there with you guys,
okay,
but I was able to watch it, and it was good discussion, and it was weird because I kept trying to answer and I forgot that I was watching a video. But yeah, all these offerings, I don't know why they had different ones for different things, but maybe we'll learn more about that.
Yeah, I'm not sure why there were different types of offerings for different things. But again, it's not really about, what makes sense to us in a sense, and it's not really about how we would design something. Because remember, this whole book of Leviticus reminds us that God is holy, and if we are to be in relationship with God and we are to approach God in a way that keeps us safe, we need to approach God in the way God says. And God has said sometimes when that relationship gets out of whack, there are things that you can do to put it back in balance. So I've said it before in this series, I'll say it again. It's not really about us. So I can't explain why we have different kinds of sacrifices, but we are going to spend just a couple more minutes on sacrifice tonight. And I will tell you, this morning, we only managed to get through one chapter after we got through finishing up with sacrifices. So hopefully we will have some good discussion tonight as well. With that, why don't we go ahead and take a look at the last part we're going to look at in terms of sacrifice. We're going to open up to Leviticus chapter 7. And Nick, would you share with us, please, Leviticus 7, verses 11 through 18.
This is the ritual of the sacrifice, the offering of well-being that one may offer to the Lord. If you offer it for thanksgiving, you shall offer with the thank offering unleavened cakes mixed with oil, unleavened wafers spread with oil, and cakes of choice flour well soaked in oil. With your thanksgiving sacrifice of well-being, you shall bring your offering with cakes of leavened bread. From this you shall offer one cake from each offering as a gift to the Lord. It shall belong to the priest. It shall belong to the priest who dashes the blood of the offering of well-being, and the flesh of your thanksgiving sacrifice of well-being shall be eaten on the day it's offered, and you shall not leave any of it until morning. But if the sacrifice you offer is a votive offering or a free will offering, it shall be eaten on the day that you offer your sacrifice, and what's left shall be eaten the next day. But what's left of the flesh of the sacrifice shall be burned up the third day. If any of the flesh of your sacrifice of well-being is eaten on the third day, it shall not be acceptable, nor shall it be credited to one who offers it. It shall be an abomination, and the one who eats of it shall incur guilt.
Okay. So we've previously had the burnt offering or whole offering. We spent some time with that. We spent some time with the grain offering, with the sin offering, with the guilt offering. And now what kind of offering are we dealing with here?
Fellowship offering.
Yeah, we have the offering of well-being. In Hebrew, it's shalamim, which is related to the word shalom, which is
peace, fellowship.
yes. So peace, wholeness, completeness, kind of that sense that everything is how it is supposed to be. So this is the sacrifice of well-being. And it breaks into three categories. What is the first type of well-being sacrifice that somebody might offer?
Thanksgiving.
Right. So what would a Thanksgiving offering be? Like what would be an occasion for that?
Bountiful harvest.
Healing,
Yeah, bountiful harvest, certainly. Something good has happened. And as a faithful person, you recognize that God was at work making that happen. And so you give something, you return something to God in thanks for that. Absolutely. So we can have a Thanksgiving offering. There's two other offerings that fall under that category of sacrifice of well-being. What are the other two types of well-being offerings?
a vow or a farewell.
Yes. So yeah, a votive offering would be what? What would be an occasion that we would make a votive offering? So if I have made a vow, if I have said, God, if you heal my spouse, I'm going to go to the temple and I'm going to make an offering. That would be a votive offering. So it is in fulfillment of a vow. And there's a variety of different vows that you could make. If I make it to my 50th birthday, I'm going to go ahead and make this sacrifice of well-being. So it is in fulfillment of a vow. And we still see this somewhat in a different form. Sometimes in the Catholic Church, people will make a vow. They say, God, if you heal my spouse, I will make a pilgrimage. Or if you heal my spouse, I will do blank. So sometimes we see that continuing, into our own time in a little bit of a different form, but that idea of we give something up to God if we have made a vow, if we have said, God, I promise that I will do this thing, that would be an occasion for one of these sacrifices of well-being. And the other one is, Nick, you mentioned it already, the other one is?
Free will.
The free will offering. Which I understand to be just something along the lines of we understand, as hopefully we do by this point, that God is God and we're not. And we are just thankful for how good God is. We have just decided for no particular reason that we should offer something to God for God being so good. So we have this here, the sacrifice of well-being. Just thinking generally about sacrifices, this notion that there is a meal involved, or that there is a meal that involves sacrifice, that has overtones of forgiveness, of atonement, of thanksgiving, of people and God somehow eating together. Does this idea in broad strokes ring any bells for people? Does it sound at all familiar?
Well, somewhat like communion.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say it sounds a bit like communion. We're going to spend a lot more time in the next couple of weeks with some of the New Testament appropriation and Christian interpretation of Leviticus, but I think here we can see an element of how we understand communion. And of course, Passover also is maybe the primary thing that helps us understand and interpret communion. But I would not sell short the impact Leviticus has on our understanding of communion either. So yeah, maybe we're already starting to see some things that put us in a little more familiar territory, because as I've said, there's a lot of stuff we're dealing with in this book that is not in our immediate realm of experience, I should say. Other questions, other thoughts, insights, things we need to throw out there in terms of sacrifice and what Leviticus has to say about that?
I have a quick question for you. The last piece part that was read said that on the third day, you were considered unclean, and that it was not appropriate to eat it. Does it have any significance at all, being the third day type of thing?
Not as far as I know. Because of course, certainly, I'm not sure. Scholars disagree on what the significance of the 3 days is. Jesus himself says, Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days. I'm going to be in the earth for 3 days. There may have been something about a belief that after 3 days, the spirit was really gone, or the life was really gone out of it. I don't necessarily know that would apply in this case, because Leviticus says the life is in the blood, and you drain the blood out of it before you complete the sacrifice. So I'm not sure. That could be one of those things that after 3 days without refrigeration, maybe that's more of a hygienic practice. I'm not sure. Or again, it could just be God says so, which is maybe not the most satisfying answer, but again, as people of faith, that should be more than satisfactory. But that is my best guess, or that series of things are my best guesses, I will say.
Well, I was thinking about that too, with the lack of obviously refrigeration. You would think that if you ate that meat the second day, you would suffer consequences, as it says in verse 18, as in botulism or something worse, because meat doesn't keep very well. Or did they salt it back then to preserve it? Because generally speaking, you don't refrigerate meat, it goes bad pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm. I'm not entirely sure what their practices might have been. Now, obviously, if it's been cooked, that probably helps it a little bit. But again, I don't think I would want to eat a steak that I cooked on Sunday night. I probably wouldn't want to eat that for dinner tonight if it had just been sitting out.
Right.
But again, with the number of people who are coming and going from that place of sacrifice, I don't know how much would be left. So I'm not sure how often that came into play. So have we had our fill of sacrifice yet?
Yeah.
Yes.
One
Okay.
more thing I was thinking about with the meat. I have a feeling, as far as what we know, I would think that the meat on the first day, I don't think we would like it too much.
Yeah, you
Not-
wouldn't want to let
not
it sit. Yeah.
Not discredited as a sacrifice, but I have a feeling none of us would like that, any of that meat, even on the first day, as far as taste goes.
Yeah, our palates definitely have a little bit different our palates have grown up with different stuff, and the animals, even a sheep or a goat, probably tastes different now than it did then. Certainly, our animals are bigger, and this is the United States. Everything is bigger here, so we have the mega size animals as well. So yeah, there might have been that. And it's funny you should say that, Fred. That is an excellent segue into our next topic in chapter 11. We're going to spend some time with clean and unclean animals. What is clean to eat? What is unclean to eat? What is clean to handle? What is unclean to handle? And we're going to spend some time with that. So why don't let me first find some people to go ahead and read for us. Robin, will you share with us in chapter 11, verses 1 through 12? Carol, if you could share with us, please, 13 through 23. Dave, if you could share with us 24 through 38. And Fred, if you can share with us 39 through 47. So before we get started, let's take a moment and let me have you guys look on your handout. Just look over the questions there so you can kind of get a sense of what you're going to be looking for as we read. So Robin, when you are ready, please go ahead and start us in chapter 11 with 1 through 12.
And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying to them, speak to the people of Israel, saying, these are the living things you may eat among all the animals that are on the earth. Whatever parts the hoof and is cloven-footed and chews the cud, among the animals you may eat. Nevertheless, among those that chew the cud or part the hoof, you shall not eat these. The camel, because it chews the cud, but does not part the hoof, is unclean to you. And the rock badger, because it chews the cud, but does not part the hoof, is unclean to you. And the hare, because it chews the cud, but does not part the hoof, is unclean to you. And the pig, because it parts the hoof and is cloven-footed, but does not chew the cud, is unclean to you. You shall not eat any of their flesh. You shall not touch their carcasses. They are unclean to you. These you may eat of all that are in the waters, everything in the waters that has fins and scales, whether in the seas or in the rivers you may eat. But anything in the seas or the rivers that has not fins or scales, of swarming creatures of the waters or the living creatures that are in the waters, is detestable to you. You shall regard them as detestable. You shall not eat any of their flesh. You shall not detest their carcasses. Everything in the waters that has not fins and scales is detestable to you.
Carol, will you pick up with 13 through 23?
These you shall regard as detestable among the birds. They shall not be eaten. They are an abomination. The eagle, the vulture, the osprey, the buzzard, the kite of any kind, every raven of any kind, the ostrich, the nighthawk, the seagull, the hawk of any kind, the little owl, the cormorant, the great owl, the water hen, the desert owl, the carrion vulture, the stork, the heron of any kind, the hopi, and the bat. All winged insects that walk upon all fours are detestable to you. But among the winged insects that walk on all fours, you may eat those that have jointed legs above their feet, which with which to leap on the ground. Of them you may eat the locust according to its kind, the bald locust according to its kind, the cricket according to its kind, and the grasshopper according to its kind. But all the other winged insects that have 4 feet are detestable to you.
And Dave, can you continue on with 24 through 38, please?
Okay, by these you shall become unclean. Whoever touches the carcass of any of them shall be unclean until the evening. And whoever carries any part of the carcass of any of them shall wash his clothes and be unclean until the evening. Every animal that has divided hoofs, but is not cleft-footed or does not chew the cud, is unclean for you. Everyone who touches one of them shall be unclean. All that walk on their paws among the animals that walk on all fours are unclean for you. Whoever touches the carcass of any of them shall be unclean until the evening. And the one who carries the carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until the evening. They are unclean for you. These are unclean for you among the creatures that swarm upon the earth: the weasel, the mouse, the great lizard, according to its kind, the gecko, the land crocodile, the lizard, the sand lizard, and the chameleon. These are unclean for you among all that swarms. Whoever touches one of them when they are dead shall be unclean until the evening. And anything upon which any of them falls when they are dead shall be unclean, whether an article of wood or cloth or skin or sacking, any article that is used for any purpose, it shall be dipped into water, and it shall be unclean until the evening, and then it shall be clean. And if any one of them falls into any earthen vessel, all that is in it shall be unclean, and you shall break the vessel. Any food that could be eaten shall be unclean if water from any such vessel comes upon it. And any liquid that could be drunk shall be unclean if it was in any such vessel. Everything on which any part of the carcass falls shall be unclean. Whether in oven or stove, it shall be broken in pieces. They are unclean and shall remain unclean for you. But a spring or a cistern holding water shall be clean, while whatever touches the carcass in it shall be unclean. If any part of their carcass falls upon you, any seed set aside for sowing, it is clean. But if the water is put on the seed and any part of their carcasses falls on it, it is unclean for you.
All right, Fred, will you take us through the end of chapter 11 there?
If an animal that you are allowed to eat dies, anyone who touches the carcass will be unclean till evening. Anyone who eats some of the carcass must wash his clothes, and he will be unclean until evening. Anyone who picks up the carcass must wash his clothes, and he will be unclean till evening. Every creature that moves about on the ground is detestable. It is not to be eaten. You are not to eat any creature that moves about on the ground, whether it moves on its belly or walks on all fours or on many feet. It is detestable. Do not defile yourselves by any of these creatures. Do not make yourselves unclean by means of them, or be made unclean by them. I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves and be holy, because I am holy. Do not make yourselves unclean by any creature that moves about on the ground. I am the Lord who brought you up out of Egypt to be your God. Therefore, be holy, because I am holy. These are the regulations concerning animals, birds, every living thing that moves in the water, and every creature that moves about on the ground. You must distinguish between the unclean and the clean, between living creatures that may be eaten and those that may not be eaten.
All right. Did anybody else start to get just a little bit hungry as we were talking about the things we can eat and the things we can't eat?
Well, that, and I'm glad we don't do all that stuff now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
when we start Yeah,
was gonna say-
weasels and skinks and lizards. That kind of those kind of thoughts. I think I'll lose a little weight thinking about those.
I was gonna say, there's a lot of things on here that we might not eat anyway, so that's something. I was gonna say, and we don't abide by these regulations, but these are some of the basis of the kosher laws. So people practicing Judaism do abide by these things. So let's start at the beginning. In order to be considered clean, a land animal needs to have three characteristics. What are those three characteristics?
Chew their cud,
One,
cleft
The hoof,
feet,
cloven footed.
right, divided hoof and cleft footed. So in order for an animal to be clean, it has to have those three things. And it goes into detail about, here are some common animals you might come across. And this is not clean because it fits some of those boxes, but not others. And the pig is specialed out for 2 verses of explanation that it is bad and you should not be eating it.
What does a cleft foot even mean, or cleft hoof?
We got the exact same question this morning. So I did what any 21st century person in America would do. I Googled it. And it showed a picture. It basically looks like the foot has 2 toes on it. So if you think of a pig's foot, yeah, it looks like they have 2 toes. As compared to, say, a horse. If you look at a horse's foot, it's all one solid hoof. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but you can't eat a pig, so no. So you're saying the pig has a cleft?
It does, but it doesn't chew its cud.
Oh,
Verse 7. Let's look at our text here. Verse 7. They're very specific about the pig. Even though it has divided hoofs and is cleft-footed, it does not chew the cud. Therefore, it is unclean for you.
it's like
So
a deer foot.
Yes, I can't remember what a deer foot looks like, but we'll take Kim at her word.
If you're a hunter, you know.
That's right. So yeah, in order for an animal that lives on the land to be considered clean, it has to check these 3 boxes, and that gives us some examples. Here are some animals that do. Here are the animals that don't, and this is why. If we jump from the land to the water, the characteristics are a little more broad. If we want to eat something that comes out of the water, either from the river or the lake or the ocean, what do its characteristics need to be?
Fins and scales.
Fins and scales. So what does that rule out?
Shrimp.
No shrimp. Crabs, no crabs.
lobster.
No lobster. Yeah, no shellfish. Octopus.
Octopus,
All
squid.
bottom feeders.
No eel.
Mhm. No eel.
Squid.
Now what
So
about
it's for sushi.
somebody said no bottom feeders. What about catfish? Do they have fins and scales?
No,
Yeah.
they don't have scales.
I don't think they got scales.
Oh,
They don't.
Oh, okay. All right. I was gonna say I was asking because I don't
Oh.
I don't know.
They're smooth skinned.
Okay.
But
So that-
a carp does have fin. A carp has fins and scales, and that is considered like a catfish, kind of a bottom feeder as well.
Right, that's true.
Right. But
I
they
just-
don't. I'm sorry, go
always-
ahead.
I just always thought of the shrimp and I just always thought of the ones that actually mostly stay on the bottom. Those are the ones that I I more considered bottom feeders, even though carp and catfish do eat that way sometimes.
Yeah, and it's interesting you should say that. We're gonna touch on that again in a minute. But I think it's interesting. Yeah, we'll.
And of course, when I say bottom feeders, I don't mean I'm definitely not knocking anybody who does eat shrimp or, you know.
So, like I said, we're gonna jump into that in a little bit. But it's interesting, you know, if it comes out of the water, there's a little less regulation on it. When we jump to things that have feathers, they give us a list of these are the sorts of birds that you should not eat. What, if anything, might all of these unclean birds have in common?
Birds of prey.
Yeah. Yeah, they're either predators or scavengers.
Yeah.
You know, obviously the vulture, it's a scavenger. It eats dead stuff. All these other animals, you know, the eagle, you know, it kills stuff and eats it. So it's kind of interesting. And in my mind, that kind of ties into some of the other, I see a common element with some of the other regulations. Animals that are clean chew the cud. They chew plants, they swallow it, they regurgitate it, they chew it some more. But they eat plants. And then it says in verse 27, nothing that walks on its paws is clean for you. So what are animals that walk on their paws?
Dogs,
Cats,
Dogs, cats,
wolves,
guinea pigs.
guinea pigs, yeah. Big
Lions.
dogs, big
Lions.
cats.
Lions and tigers and bears. Oh my.
Oh my.
Yeah. and dogs and cats and wolves, you know, like big dogs, big cats.
Raccoons, weasels, squirrels.
Yeah, all of those things that have paws, they are also all scavengers or predators, right? Certainly raccoons. But yeah, I think it's interesting that many of the things that are unclean, you know, they tend to eat stuff that we might find kind of detestable. But it's also interesting that if it's in the water, all bets are off. Because if it has fins and scales, it could be anything from a sardine, which are little and delicious, I might add, all the way up to a tuna, which is, you know, is a predator. So if it comes out of the water, it doesn't really matter whether it's a predator, as long as it has scales.
That's why they were all fit and trim back then, because they were all vegetarians, it sounds like. It was just
Yeah.
easier.
There was a lot of vegetarianism going on because meat was a high-end commodity. You know, also they had parasites in their intestines and, you know, all that sort of stuff that we don't think about anymore. That's why people were thin too, because they couldn't eat because they were miserable. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. There's some common threads among kind of these regulations about what might be clean or might be unclean, which I just find kind of fascinating. I also think it's interesting. It kind of struck me as fascinating that certain insects are not okay to eat, but among the ones that are okay to eat are locusts. And it kind of struck me as fascinating that locusts are okay to eat, because if you get enough people eat, usually locusts, we think of them as swarms of locusts come and they eat up the crops and it's a disaster. But if you eat the locusts, it makes them go away and it gives you something to eat. So I just find it kind of interesting that an insect that can cause a giant problem, you can eat that. So I think of like the Asian carp that they're trying to keep out of Lake Michigan. They're saying, let's catch these and sell them to people in China, because people in China will eat this. So maybe maybe China can help us out by eating all these stupid things. Maybe it's the same thing with the locusts. We can just eat them all and then they're not a problem.
I believe John the Baptist ate them in the desert, did he not? Locusts?
Yes, locusts and honey. You got it. So see, right there, we had another New Testament connection. I love it.
They also mention bats in with birds and I believe bat is technically not a bird, it's a mammal. And they
Right.
Yes,
generally eat only insects as far as I know.
yes.
Yeah.
They do eat insects. I don't know if that makes them a predator or not. They do seem to harbor an awful lot of disease.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if people would have necessarily, they certainly wouldn't have known, oh, they're a host for blank, but there may have been some sort of inkling that, gosh, when there's a lot of bats around, people tend to get really sick. So there may be
What
something reflected in there.
I would also say that almost any insect that a bat eats is an insect that is not on our list to eat. It's eating like flies and mosquitoes. So the insects that it's eating is not the ones that we're allowed to eat.
Okay, so maybe there's some of that idea at play here too, that bats are not eating locusts. Bats are eating winged insects that, you know, are not things that we can consume. So maybe there's some of that going on too.
Mhm.
That'll preach. So we're talking about animals that are unclean. So we're not talking just about this is what you can and cannot eat, but we're also talking about what you should and should not be handling. So what happens if you come into contact with one of these unclean animals?
You are unclean.
You are unclean. And what all does that mean? What all is entailed with that?
You
Is
can't
it-
be eaten.
You can't be eaten. That's good. Very good. We like that.
Now the second part of the chapter 11, it was talking mostly about dead things like carcasses and stuff.
Mhm.
But in the beginning where I was reading about the pig, that also was considered to be an unclean animal, and that was living. So most of it was carcasses in the end, but the specific ones that he says were the hooves and all that stuff, that was considered unclean also.
Yes. Well, it says here in verse 8, their carcasses you shall not touch. So, you know, even if the pig is dead, you don't touch it.
So it is considered the dead things then. Makes you
Yes,
unclean.
I had a colleague who was a rabbi said you can observe many of these commandments if you just abide by the understanding that if it's dead or wet, don't touch it. So that's like a practical, common sense approach to how we can observe many of these things. But if you become unclean, you know, there's a carcass of a animal that walks on all fours and has paws, and you pick it up and you move the carcass. You know, it dies in the middle of your farm field, and you don't want to attract vultures. You don't want to attract more unclean animals. You pick it up and you don't like your neighbor, so you throw it in his field. You bring it over to Bob's house. Oh, sorry. And what happens? You become unclean. What's the?
You have to wash your clothes, and why is it only till evening, I wonder? What happens at evening that makes you all of a sudden not unclean? When the sun goes down?
Right. Sundown is the start of a new day.
Okay.
So if you move something at 3 o'clock, at 6 o'clock, you're clean again.
If it's dark.
Yes. And under certain circumstances, you may need to wash your clothes. You may need to wash your, a vessel. If you had a water sack with you and it brushed up against the thing, you may need to clean that. But yeah, at sundown, at the close of the day, kind of at that time of renewal, that uncleanness goes away. Sometimes with a ritual washing, sometimes just by the passage of time. So in terms of being unclean, at least with respect to these sorts of things, does this seem like it is a really critical thing? Is it the sort of thing that is, a life-altering occurrence?
No.
Mm-mm.
Right. So, many people would be unclean a lot of the time. And it probably, so the implications are, other people should not touch you while you are unclean, because uncleanness it's considered contagious. I'm unclean, and Tom just can't keep his hands off of me, and he comes up and he grabs me, and Tom is unclean now because he has handled something that's unclean. So, you don't touch people. You don't go and offer a sacrifice at the temple when you are unclean. So some of it has to do with being fit for worship, and some of it has to do with, how you interact with other people. So in the New Testament, Jesus gets into some argument. He gets into some discussion with people about things being clean and unclean. So sometimes Christian interpretation goes in the direction of saying, oh, this person may have been unclean, and they make it sound like, oh, this person would have been completely cut off from the rest of society because of this uncleanness. Well, I mean, I guess they're cut off from part of it until sundown, or until they're ritually clean. So sometimes when we see about clean and unclean, it is not quite the life-altering state that we think it is. Now, there's other things. If you're considered unclean because of leprosy, that's a whole other that's a whole other can of worms. But many times, things that made people ritually unclean, they were just kind of stuff that happened in the course of life, and it was a matter of waiting till sundown and possibly bathing. So we want to remember that clean and unclean was not necessarily something that cut you off from the life of the community.
So
I have
does
a
it,
weird, go ahead, Fred.
I was just gonna say, so, as far as, you say you're unclean, and then, it could be an hour, it could be 3 hours later. So you clean yourself with clean water, and then at sundown or around sundown before the next day, you're clean again. Does it seem like, even though Jesus isn't around yet, God is kind of giving us a chance to, even if we goof up and we get dirty, if we become unclean, there's only a time, there is a time to become clean again in a short period of time, possibly.
Yeah, certainly as related to things that you touch or things that you eat. There is a period that you can become clean again. There's some other things that are a little more complicated, but even there are ways that it is possible to go back into that. And I think maybe it has something to do with this idea of, again, if you are unclean, you don't go to the temple and offer a sacrifice and worship there. So some of it again has to do with you need to approach God in the way that God says is acceptable. And part of it is you need to approach your neighbor in ways that God says is acceptable. If I am unclean, I got to make sure that I get clean before I go and interact with my neighbor. So it seems to be maybe clean and unclean has something to do with when we are fit to enter into relationship or fit to continue in relationship. Which I thought was interesting.
Well, I was gonna say this thought. I'm assuming that how we read this, that pigs were wild at that time, because you would be totally unclean if you had a pig farm, wouldn't you?
You wouldn't have a pig farm if you were part of the people of Israel.
Right. But
Yeah. So yeah, you would be pretty
I'm
much
assuming-
unclean all the time, and you wouldn't be able to eat the animals you're raising.
Right. So they were wild pigs, I'm assuming.
Yeah, it could have been wild pigs, or it could have been, you see your neighbors over there, you see your Philistine neighbors over there. Don't go and raid their pig farm. So there probably were domestic pigs somewhere around there. They were aware of the pig, but they were not raising them.
Hopefully they didn't have to smell bacon cooking and have
That's
the
right.
ultimate, temptation.
Oh, yeah, that'd be tough.
Bacon.
Yeah, I'm sure that bacon would
Now I'm
make,
hungry.
yeah, I'm sure that bacon would have made some of that other meat taste better.
That's right. Well, what kind of entrails are these? You know, you're feeding me some kind of organ meats. Yeah, but it's wrapped in bacon. Oh, well, in that case. So, but on the topic of animals that we consume and animals that we don't, I also thought it was interesting in verse 39, what they say there. Even if it is an animal that is clean for you to eat, if it dies, if you touch it, you still become unclean. So kind of that understand, and you certainly don't eat it. So that understanding of if an animal, let's say it's a cow, cows are considered a clean animal. If the cow just drops dead, we're not supposed to eat it. It needs to be slaughtered in order for it to be fit to eat, which I also think is an interesting, if it dies on its own, then it's unclean. If it's purposely slaughtered, then it's clean. I just think that's an interesting and probably good hygienic distinction. So what insight does God offer for why God is giving all these commandments in chapter 11?
Because he's holy.
Yes, and because God is holy, what is the people's response?
You should be holy.
That's right. So because God is holy, because God is distinct and set apart in this way, the people are supposed to mirror that in their own practices, their own ways of life. And remember, another piece of that is, you know, what goes on our table, what goes in our body, how we interact with the creation around us, all of those things offer us choices, and we can make a choice that honors God, or we don't. But we should be thinking about it. So every aspect of our lives is an opportunity to honor God. So in thinking about what we put in our bodies, what goes on our table, even that's also God's business. So I think there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of things going on here.
So I have a question. So in Leviticus, which is the time of Leviticus, wandering in the wilderness, 1400 BC or whatever, God tells Moses, these are the unclean animals you're not to eat. And in the first century AD, Peter gets a vision by the Spirit saying that whatever God has made is not unclean. So from 1400 BC to first century AD, did God change his mind, or is it the understanding of the writers of Leviticus who was mistaken?
Ooh, that's quite the question. I think the thing we need to look at first and foremost in Acts is, yes, the vision happens to be of unclean animals, and God says, yes, you can eat of these animals. God has made it. Don't call it unclean. I think what goes on our plate is only of secondary importance. The reason Peter has that dream is because right at that moment, some Romans are coming to his house because he's supposed to go and preach to some Gentiles. So I think that vision is a way of revealing, yes, people who we thought were unclean are now fit to be at the table with us. I think that's the primary purpose of that vision. I think, I don't know if I would go so far as to say, well, yeah, God can certainly change God's mind. That's okay. And sometimes people get a little squeamish at that, but God can change God's mind. If we decide that God can't do something, we have just, I think we have just made a mistake. So it's certainly possible that God has said, my take on it is God is now saying, because I am entering a new part of my mission, some of these things are going to change. We are in new circumstances, so we need new understandings. That's kind of how I would read it. And certainly in Mark's gospel, it's really explicit. Jesus says, don't you understand that everything that goes into your mouth goes through the rest of your body and it comes out the other end? It's not what goes into you that defiles, it's what comes out. And it even says, thus he declared all foods clean. So I would say it's maybe God is moving his mission into a new phase. And so God has said, some things are going to change. Some of the ways of life are going to change. But also remember, we're going to touch on this in a minute. This is a part of help. This is part of what helps the people remember who they are. People have been conquered, people have been exiled, people have been returned. Some of what helps them remember who they are is this idea that even what goes on my plate matters to God. So for Peter to get a vision that says, you know what, this practice that has been handed down for 1,400 years, that your parents taught you and their parents taught them, that is part of the covenant. This is, again, part of what tells us who we are as God's people. You know what? Don't worry about it. That would have been not only a complete shock to Peter, but let me just say this. We've learned over the last year how much people love it when you change stuff at church. Similar sort of thing here. Peter was probably appalled at this idea, but he did understand that this is God's revelation. So I think sometimes maybe we take it even a little too lightly. This was a big deal. This would kind of be like saying, yeah, I know we've told you to have bread and wine for communion for the last 2,000 years. But instead, you know what, just go ahead and use anything you've got. That probably would not go over real well with people. That may have been, I think maybe that's a parallel to what was going on for Peter. Well, I'm catching my breath here. Other thoughts, questions on what we've touched on? I have a couple other things I want to look at in terms of clean and unclean tonight here. So there's a couple different ways we can think about clean and unclean. But maybe the simple understanding of it is if something is clean, it is suitable for human use and under proper conditions, suitable for human consumption. And if it is done properly, it is suitable for ritual use. If it is unclean, it is not suitable for human use. It is not suitable for human consumption. And under no circumstances is it fit for ritual use. You cannot sacrifice any of these unclean animals as one of our sacrifices, as a burnt offering, guilt offering, well-being offering. If it's one of the unclean animals, no, don't even think about it. So we think about what is acceptable for human consumption, what is not acceptable for human consumption. So why does this matter? Why does it matter that we have a distinction between clean and unclean?
God said so.
Amen. Yeah, first and foremost, God says so. And again, that should be good enough. I think part of what's going on here is there may be a little bit of naming of things that are meant to be distinct from the people around them. We may be naming some practices or naming some customs of other peoples, and we're saying, yeah, you know what? Those people over there do it. Part of what makes us different is that we don't do that. We don't just, whatever wanders across the yard, we don't just kill it and eat it, because God has said, what you put in your body matters to me. One commentator said, these laws meant for the Israelite the fulfillment of a divinely appointed way of life. By the observance of these laws of purification, Israel felt that it was dedicating its life to God. So again, that idea of this is another way that we can keep God in front of us. This is another way we can keep God's will as one of our guiding factors. There may also be an idea that there's a sense of order. There's an understanding of how the world works. When we look at the creation story in Genesis, it is a story of God setting boundaries. It is a story of God making very deliberate separations. God separates light from dark. God separates earth from heaven. God separates water from land. And remember, we talk about God is serious about these boundaries. We see the Tower of Babel. We saw that story of Nadab and Abihu. God is serious about this, folks. So maybe there's a sense of there's some boundaries, like animals should have cloven feet and cleft foot and chew the cud. And if you cross the boundary, maybe that's not a good thing. So that the pig crosses that boundary because it has some of these characteristics, but not all of them. So maybe there's an idea that mixing categories is not good. A shrimp, it lives in the water, which is a good thing, but it doesn't have fins or scales. So it's a water creature, but it doesn't have these things. So there may be some of that going on. And let me throw this out there. That idea of clean and unclean, what's fit for human consumption and what's not. Is that concept still relevant?
I think it's more of a socially accepted, like things are based off of social acceptance more so than these particular rules, I kind of think. I mean, we're not going to eat a dog because we're just not going to eat a dog. We think of it as our pet.
Right.
We don't think about it as, walking on feet.
So the source of the distinction is different, but that idea of what is and isn't fit for us to eat, I think is still somewhat relevant. And dog is a good example. There are places in the world where that is a perfectly acceptable thing to eat. What about eating bugs?
I remember my brother having to learn what bugs to eat when he was in the military. They, knew how to eat off of trees, like what barks and what insects, and they had to do it. Kind of gross.
Right? Yeah. Generally, a lot of people in the United States would be like, no, there's no way I'm going to eat bugs. I hear there are people saying, oh, eating more bugs is good for the environment. They have less impact on the environment than cattle or even pigs, to which I say, that's great for other people. But you don't have to go very far where eating bugs is perfectly normal and acceptable. They are considered fit for consumption. If you go to Mexico and somebody asks if you want chapulines, those are grasshoppers. So
Caviar.
Caviar. Yeah,
That's true.
some people think that's really wonderful, great stuff. Other people go, no, I know what that is, and I think it's kind of gross. Is it acceptable or not? And again, has anyone here ever watched the show Iron Chef?
Yeah.
Yes.
So I would dare say that maybe the socially acceptable rule in Japan is if it comes out of the ocean, yeah, I'll try it. Whereas maybe in a more Western culture, we would say if it comes out of the ocean and it's one of, a very limited number of things, we'll eat it. But, sea urchins and sea cucumbers and crab brains and stuff like that, yeah, maybe not. So I think that notion of clean and unclean is still something that we deal with. Still something we deal with, but I think, like Kim said, it is not rooted necessarily in scripture as much as it is in culture. So there's things that in other cultures people find totally normal that we would find repulsive. I would guess that perhaps folks in other cultures might find the idea of sausage absolutely repulsive, or head cheese. We eat it because it's normal, but other people would go, wait, you're going to take what and stuff it into what and then eat it? So I think that's it's just an interesting concept. I think maybe it is more prevalent than we think. We don't use those terms, but I think the concept is still surprisingly relevant.
Yeah, I never had head cheese before, but I know what it is. You could tell me it tastes like cotton candy. I'm not going to try it.
Other thoughts on clean and unclean animals, either for consumption or for just handling?
Yeah, one of my thoughts is a lot of the things, I mean, even though, today we do eat some of the ones back then that were considered unclean, I would say that a bigger percentage of the ones that were not, that are supposed to be unclean, we do not eat today, like eagles and hawks and that's just to name a few. So it, with God saying that, be holy because I'm holy, he doesn't, there's no way he expects us to be like him, but I think he is setting some rules, and they're not that hard of rules, but just follow them.
Yeah, some of them are, we might follow without even knowing. Absolutely. And again, that idea that it is all rooted in God is holy, God is distinct and set apart. God's people must be distinct and set apart for the purpose of serving God. So at this point, we are starting to get a little bit closer to the end of our time together for the evening. I would like to propose that rather than jump into, we have 2 more chapters I want to read in their entirety to get the flavor for the type of stuff that's in Leviticus. Rather than jumping in and stopping, I would like to suggest that we conclude our time for the evening and we start right with chapter 23 when we gather again next week. Is that a workable plan for folks?
Makes
Sure.
sense.
Yes.
Okay, very good. We will, I think we should be able to get through those 2 chapters and then we'll move on to our final handout the following week. So any other questions, thoughts, insights?
No, sir.
Bon voyage, Carol.
Tomorrow.
I will miss
Yes, and
you.
Carol, we will certainly miss seeing you in person on Sundays, but thanks to the wonder of technology, we can still have you with us in study.
Amen.
Great, thank you.
Well, let's close our time together tonight by praying the Lord's Prayer. Our Father,
Father,
who art in
who art in
heaven,
heaven,
hallowed be thy name.
Amen.
Thy kingdom come, thy will be
That will
done
be done
on
on earth as it is in heaven.
in heaven.
Give us this day our daily bread,
Bread,
and forgive us our
our
trespasses,
trespass,
as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.
evil,
For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever.
now and ever.
Amen.
Amen.
Blessings on everyone's evening. We will see everybody soon.
Thank
God
you.
bless you in your travels, Carol.
Thank you.
Good night.